Armistice Day, 1938. Each year, the war dead were remembered in a ceremony that little changed. But the peace of this Armistice Day was the peace Chamberlain had just brought back from Munich. The immediate crisis of war had passed, and a great wave of relief had swept over the country. But amidst the solemn mood of Remembrance Day, one question could no longer be avoided. Was it really possible to purchase a lasting peace by appeasement? Those who saw Munich as bringing nearer the Nazi domination of Europe, and thus war, increasingly questioned the complacency of the past. With remarkable frankness, the newsreels harnessed the high emotions evoked by the memory of the First World War to bring about a change of public opinion. In presenting the armistice ceremony, cinemas up and down the country spelt out a new message.
There need never be another cenotaph if Britain is strong enough to defy the threat of war. We in Britain have a hatred of war, but to fear war is to provoke it. Britain must be strong. If our fighting services are great, our youth may live in them today. If they are weak, our manhood must die in them tomorrow. Britain must be strong until the world returns to sanity, and all men may live together in peace.
War for Chamberlain was the ultimate disaster. He understood its horrors. But the diplomatic traditions of his life and the personal standards of his own conduct no longer corresponded to the realities of totalitarian Europe. Chamberlain appealed to reason and deliberately set about projecting himself as a leader in the cause of peace.
A war today is fundamentally different from all the wars of the past, inasmuch as its first and its most numerous victims would not be the professional fighters, but the civilian population. And when the war was over, whoever was the victor, it would leave behind a trail of suffering and loss that 2 generations would not obliterate. Not many generations had passed since we were at war with the United States of America. Today, such a conflict has gone far beyond the bounds of possibility. In my own lifetime, we were within an ace of war with France. Today, such a catastrophe seems as remote as war with America. Indeed, our relations with France are so close that they go far beyond merely legal obligation. They are founded on identity of interest. If then we have already succeeded in reducing the field of possible war so far? Is there any reason why we should not carry our efforts further still until we can attain such general security that we can lay aside our weapons and devote ourselves to the benefit of the human race?
The European situation convinced Chamberlain that some rearmament was necessary, but the mistaken premises of his diplomacy were reflected in mistaken assumptions of strategy. In the West, Britain was allied to France. Seen through British eyes, the balance of power could be preserved through the defense of France's eastern frontiers. But seen through French eyes, the balance of power in continental Europe involved Eastern Europe, and in the years after Versailles, France had signed alliances with Germany's eastern neighbors, Czechoslovakia and Poland. Britain believed that the French army, victorious in the First World War, would provide a bulwark against the Germans in the West. Protected by the sea and her navy, she would not need to send again a large army to France. The French and British General Staff drew the lessons from the First World War that attacks on strongly fortified lines were suicidal. They were determined to avoid the losses incurred in Flanders and on the Somme. Their military and political thinking took refuge behind the fortresses of the Maginot Line, awaiting attack and expecting a protracted war. Defense may avoid a defeat, but it cannot win the war. Victory would be achieved through Bomber Command, who would bomb the Ruhr and destroy the enemy's industrial capacity for war, while a diplomatic and naval blockade would bring Germany to her knees through attrition. By 1938, some of the flaws of this strategy were recognized. New bombers, not yet ready, would be needed to penetrate to other industrial centers lying beyond the 200-mile range of the existing bombers. The much-publicized build-up of the Luftwaffe was Germany's answer. It was feared that a British bombing offensive would invite retaliation, and a chain of radar stations supporting an advanced system of defense was planned. Priority was shifted from Bomber Command to Fighter Command. In France, the shock of Munich and the loss of 35 good Czech divisions was seen as destroying the planned strategic balance and led to demands for a sizable British army committed to the continent instead of a mere token force. In Britain, however, priority so far was being given to the Navy and the Air Force, and General Ironside noted in his diary that the difficulty of ever again sending an army to France was solved by the fact that there was not one to send. With their thinking bounded by the experiences of the First World War, British and French commanding generals were incapable of the radical new strategic thinking this situation demanded. Nor did a lead come from the government. Chamberlain still believed that the peace would be saved by diplomacy. He visited Mussolini in January, accompanied by Halifax, believing that Italy's role in Europe was an important influence on events. Mussolini, in his turn, set out to impress his visitors with the might of the fascist state. Chamberlain thought that Mussolini's influence over Hitler had helped save the peace of Europe at Munich. He wrote to his sister, "I feel that Rome at the moment is the end of the axis on which it is easiest to make an impression." But serious talks proved difficult to arrange. The days were spent in viewing the spectacles provided by the Duce. Mussolini rejected all Chamberlain's suggestions that he should restrain the Führer, his Axis partner, from further aggression. The visit was a failure. Despite Mussolini's hypocritical show of welcome and friendship, Chamberlain and Halifax had not impressed either Ciano or Mussolini, who described them as tired sons of a long line of rich men who will lose their empire. Ciano thought the British were ready for any sacrifice for peace, and hastened to telephone Ribbentrop that the visit had been a fiasco. But Chamberlain, with his customary optimism, commented, "I may say at once that I have achieved all I expected to get and more, and that I am satisfied that the journey has definitely strengthened the chances of peace." Public opinion found it increasingly difficult to reconcile the assumption of Chamberlain's diplomacy with the self-evident evils of the Nazi state. In the previous November, the Nazis had started a wave of organized pogroms against Germans of Jewish faith, which shocked the British public. Newspapers reproduced photographs of synagogues in flames, of Jewish shops broken and plundered, of helpless victims taken to concentration camps. And these events aroused in the majority of Englishmen a sense of outrage. Private money was collected for the hapless refugees who were permitted to come to Britain. Boatloads of children from the German and Austrian homes, sent by their parents to the safety of England, landed at Harwich and other ports. The British conscience was deeply stirred. The disquiet reached its climax when the public was brought face to face with the brutality of the destruction of what was left of Czechoslovakia on the 15th of March, 1939.
Once again, the rattle of a German army on the march echoes in Europe. Where that march may end, no man can foretell, least of all the man who gave the order. But here before our eyes unfolds the drama of a nation dying. Hitler's troops enter Moravia. At Munich, the Führer gave his word that he wanted no more land in Europe. These pictures show you what his word is worth. From the border, those divisions rolled solidly on through a bitter day in March. This is the diplomacy of this year of grace. Power, politics, and the rule of force. Ask yourself now the question asked by the British Prime Minister.
Is this the last attack upon a small state? Or is it to be followed by others? Is this in fact a step in the direction of an attempt to dominate the world by force?
That was the German invasion of Czechoslovakia. You have seen the map change once again in Europe. Take warning and offer yourself for national service.
The Prime Minister's question, posed during a speech at Birmingham, for the first time reflected the changed public mood since Munich. Chamberlain recognized that Britain could not help Czechoslovakia, but to voice now a policy of appeasement would lose him the confidence of the country. He warned Hitler that although the nation regarded wars as senseless, this did not mean that it had lost its fiber and would not resist to the utmost a challenge to its principles if ever made. This marked the turning point in British policy. In London, the long-planned state visit of President Lebrun was filled with a new significance. The state visit was intended to reassure Britain, France, and Europe that the older traditions of the Empire and the Republic could more than match the new dictators. The alliance, founded in 1904 and strengthened in the face of another German menace, had, though at great sacrifice, proved victorious during the First World War. By stressing tradition, what was emphasized was a victorious past. This was the last great ceremonial occasion when the people believed they were witnessing a meeting of the two great world powers. France and Britain had once determined the fate of Europe. The majority believed that with a newfound sense of purpose, they would do so again. The cabinet agreed that the defense of France was as important as the defense of the British Isles themselves, and assured France of increased military support, and 4 divisions were promised at once, should war come. As the state visit of the man who was to be the last president of the Third Republic drew to its splendid close in the historic honor of a banquet by the Lord Mayor, Hitler had already embarked upon the pocket battleship Deutschland to take from Lithuania the port of Memel. This was Hitler's first appearance in the Baltic and his last bloodless triumph. But there were now no weak-willed neighbors left. Memel was of little importance to Germany, but the consequences of this display of force, coming so soon after Czechoslovakia, were far-reaching. Hitler's claims on Poland and offers of friendship were rejected by the Poles. The war of nerves Hitler's aggression had brought about hastened the momentous change in British foreign policy, which had begun to take shape after the occupation of Prague. Britain now set out to strengthen the resolve of Germany's neighbors, for no one knew who would be next engulfed in Hitler's new order. The map of Eastern Europe had changed once again. The Poles now prepared to resist Hitler should he attempt to seize another Baltic port, Danzig. Discussions with Britain had already taken place to present a joint front against Hitler on the continent. Only a few days earlier, when Poland's ally, Romania, was thought to be threatened by Germany, Britain sought Polish support in order to prevent the oil of Romania falling into German hands. The possibility of Polish help for Romania turned on the British willingness to guarantee and back up Poland. The British Foreign Office was also searching for a way to respond to Soviet offers of support. Efforts were made to associate the Soviet Union with France and England in a joint declaration of solidarity for the defense of Romania and Poland. But Poland and Romania feared Russia as much as the Germans, and the Soviet Union suspected the West. Chamberlain, too, suspected the trustworthiness and military value of the Soviets. The British cabinet was therefore driven to seek new solutions. On 31st March, Chamberlain announced in the House of Commons the momentous British guarantee to Poland. This was followed a week later by the Anglo-Polish Agreement, which bound Britain to come to Poland's aid if Polish independence were threatened by Germany. Britain was now committed to fight if Hitler again used force against a weak neighbor. Before the public had time to catch up with these diplomatic moves, Mussolini, not to be left entirely behind, sprang the conquest of Albania upon a startled world. For the public, this now simplified the issue. The dictators were believed to be acting in collusion. The Pact of Steel between Italy and Germany a month later reinforced this feeling. To meet this new threat, now in the Mediterranean, the guarantees were extended to Romania and Greece. British war preparations were now publicized. It was announced that the territorial army was to be doubled. On the 26th of April, the government introduced conscription, but only men of the 20 to 21 age group were to be called up for 6 months' training. The introduction of even this limited conscription in peacetime was a startling step. These measures were important in reassuring public opinion. They were also intended to impress Hitler, but they did not effectively add much to Britain's military strength. The main attention continued to be given to aerial defense. Production emphasis shifted from the strategically offensive bomber force to enlarging the defensive squadrons of fighter command. Civil defense was vigorously pursued under the control of the Home Secretary. Instruction was provided in the wearing of gas masks in case of gas attack. Anti-aircraft guns and searchlights were rapidly increased around the major cities. Plans were perfected for the evacuation of pregnant women, the old, and the sick. The schoolchildren were given special instruction. Nothing seemed to have been forgotten. The pictures of the National Gallery were moved to safety, the stained windows of the medieval cathedrals of England were taken out, and the priceless manuscripts of the British Museum were carried to bomb-proof shelters. The evident thoroughness of the preparations helped psychologically to prepare the country for the possible outbreak of war. The next international crisis duly materialized over the status of Danzig. The Versailles settlement had given Poland an outlet to the sea, and thereby created a corridor of Polish territory which divided Prussia. But the German population of Danzig was given internal self-government under the League of Nations, while its economic and foreign relations were placed under Polish control. These complicated arrangements, and the existence of German minorities in Poland, provided Hitler with a pretext for further aggression. On April 3, 1939, Hitler secretly ordered the army to prepare for the destruction of Poland. As long as he was elsewhere occupied, it had suited Hitler to live on terms of amity with the Poles. The Poles had even shared in the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia in 1938, but now it was Poland's turn. Apparently friendly German approaches were giving way to threats in public and private. Neville Henderson, the British ambassador in Berlin, thought the Danzig and the corridor issues were easily capable of reasonable solution. The Poles would not budge. For them, the loss of territory in times past had been the prelude to the loss of independence. They desired to live peaceably with both their powerful neighbors, but in the last resort, they were prepared to fight and to die for their country. Within the historic town of Danzig, the Nazis prepared the way through paramilitary and youth movements. Demonstrations and marches were organized. With their recent successes behind them, their arrogance and confidence increased. By August, the Danzig issue had become a part of the crisis confrontation between Poland and Germany. Tension along the frontiers increased as the possibility of war drew nearer. Chamberlain thought that Britain's publicly proclaimed readiness to go to war would deter Hitler from taking the final step against Poland. But by now, Hitler no longer believed that Britain and France would actually fight. The announcement on the 21st of August that the Soviet Union had negotiated a non-aggression pact with Germany and that Ribbentrop was flying to Moscow to sign it came as a great shock to the public, both in Germany and in Britain. No one had anticipated the possibility of an agreement between the Nazis and the Bolsheviks. The Soviet Union had begun by negotiating with Britain and France for an alliance earlier in the year, but the Nazis were prepared to purchase Soviet neutrality at the cost of Poland. Stalin made his choice. 2 days after the negotiations were officially adjourned with the Western powers, Ribbentrop arrived to sign the pact. For the British public, this clarified the moral issues. All the dictators were now in one camp. Britain would still fulfill her obligations. Great principles were at stake. In the person of Halifax, the government directly addressed the nation.
Throughout their history, the British people have always felt bound to oppose attempts by one power to dominate Europe at the expense of others. After the events, therefore, of the earlier part of this year, which had shaken all confidence, we tried to make it clear by word and deed that we were prepared to assist those countries which felt their independence immediately threatened and were ready to defend their freedom. That was why we introduced compulsory service and made efforts unprecedented in time of peace to expand and equip the armed forces of the Crown and to place both the civil and military defences of the country in a state of full preparedness. That was the reason why we gave our undertaking to Poland. It is not the British way to go back upon obligations. We have never had, and have not today, the remotest intention of attacking Germany. But if misunderstanding between Germany and Great Britain is to be removed, I repeat that there must be some certainty about the future of Europe. And that is why we feel obliged to resist attempts to alter the map of Europe by constant appeals to force. I would earnestly hope that in face of all the consequences of a resort to force, and before any step is taken which cannot be retraced, reason may yet prevail.
Kampffliegerangriff auf einen militärisch wichtigen Eisenbahnknotenpunkt.
Without warning, at dawn on 1st of September 1939, the Luftwaffe attacked Poland. The Poles were to be the first people of Europe to experience the Blitzkrieg, the devastating combination of air and mechanized attack which found the Poles unprepared. The dive bombing of defenseless villages and towns was designed to break the people's will to resist. The concentration of attacks on lines of communication prevented the full deployment and movement of the Polish army. In this way, the cohesion of the Polish defenses was completely disrupted. The Polish air force of some 500 planes was caught on the ground and within 48 hours, for all practical purposes, had ceased to exist. This method gave the Germans tactical mastery of the battle from the outset. In London, the news of the invasion of Poland was received with calm. At 10 a.m. on September the 1st, the Polish ambassador communicated the facts of German aggression and invoked the Anglo-Polish Treaty. That evening, the British warned the Germans that Britain would honor her obligations and called on the Germans to withdraw from Poland. This was the last night of peace. On September 3rd, the British ambassador delivered an ultimatum in Berlin due to expire at 11 a.m. The BBC announced that the Prime Minister would speak at 11:15.
I am speaking to you from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany. We have a clear conscience. We have done all that any country could do to establish peace. But a situation in which no word given by Germany's ruler could be trusted, and no people or country could feel itself safe, has become intolerable. And now that we have resolved to finish it, I know that you will all play your part with calmness and courage. Now may God bless you all, and may He defend the right. For it is evil things that we shall be fighting against. Brute force, bad faith, injustice, oppression, and persecution. And against them I am certain that the right will prevail. The government has given instructions for the following important announcements. Closing of places of entertainment. All cinemas, theaters, and other places of entertainment are to be closed immediately until further notice.
It was a false alarm. The Luftwaffe did not come to England, and the cinemas were too important a channel of communication to remain closed needlessly. They joined the war effort and reopened to show the first.
Never before in all history has the British Empire been so well prepared to defend its interests as it is in this tragic autumn of 1939. The world knows that Britain has not sought war. We believe faithfully that posterity will acquit this generation of these islands of any desire for war. Yet because the threat of conflict has been held against us so long, we have spent many months building up our great resources with tremendous organization. In the simple, moving words of the Prime Minister, we are ready. With a potential army estimated at 6 million, with a great military tradition, Poland was defending her freedom. Meanwhile, evacuation of children from the danger zones of England and Scotland carried on.
The message was pressed home that Britain had not been caught surprised. Plans made before the conflict were now implemented efficiently and smoothly. The assumption was still made that the fighting on land would be mainly sustained by the great and well-prepared French armies. In presenting the well-organized evacuation, the newsreels reflected the events. But the next item was war propaganda to counter the success of the Blitzkrieg. Utilizing the illusion of the cinema, the public was presented with an image of French superiority.
These pictures, exclusive to go on British News, show how on maneuvers the tanks have made light of the roughest country. Watch them as they roll forward, this mighty vanguard of a modern army. Their armor plate is built from a secret steel process which no known shell can pierce. .670-ton tanks led the French onslaught. Britain's great ally, France, has the finest army the world has ever seen, and this is a small part of it. Battleships of no man's land, they helped to win the war of freedom against tyranny.
By the time this make-believe war was shown to the public, all that was left of Poland was beleaguered Warsaw and routed armies. The Poles were attacked from the north, west and south by the Germans, and on the 17th of September by the Russians from the east. Within days, the Polish armies were surrounded but continued to fight where they stood. The German panzer divisions reached the outskirts of Warsaw on September 8th. Unwilling to incur the heavy losses of house-to-house fighting in the city streets, Hitler ordered the German army to invest the capital. After a devastating bombardment which destroyed acres of the city and caused heavy civilian casualties, Warsaw surrendered on September 27th. During the month of fighting, the Wehrmacht needed almost all its frontline divisions to defeat the Poles. With more than 40,000 casualties and all the best divisions engaged in the east, Hitler's generals told him that no new major military operation could be undertaken for several months. During the whole of September, the Ruhr had laid open to determined French thrust. But Hitler had counted on the unwillingness of the Allied generals to commit themselves to an offensive. Now, the complete destruction of Poland created a situation where the Western powers remained at war for an ally already lost. In England, the 1st Division of troops were being organized to form the advance party of the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, in accordance with promises made by the Cabinet in the previous spring. But the neglect of the British Army in the 1930s and the diversion of resources to the Air Force meant that the British military build-up of France would be a slow one. Britain did not expect to make a large contribution to French fighting strength on land before the second year of the war. Only 4 divisions were sent to France by the winter of 1939, and no armored division. But with their superb morale and excellent training, the troops were eager and ready to fight. The BEF, under the command of Lord Gord, was subordinated to the supreme command of General Gamelin, whose extraordinary calmness struck the British generals. Gamelin, after the first weeks of war, abandoned altogether the little initiative he'd shown at the outset. Few casualties were suffered by the Allies as they waited and watched whilst Hitler built up his armies. The Allies were under the illusion that time was on their side. The longer the phony war lasted, the better the chance of an Allied victory when the battle began. But there was also public disquiet whether the war could be won by mere passivity. The Prime Minister's next speech was made up into film to convince the public that under his leadership, Britain was really fighting, and scenes were indeed cut in to magnify the war effort.
I had hoped that in my time, at any rate, war might have been averted. But since that day, when war was declared, my sole thought and all my actions have been directed to one purpose only, namely, to do all I could in the closest conjunction with our dauntless French allies to bring this war to a successful conclusion. And vast numbers of men, armed with the most powerful weapons of destruction that science can devise, are watching one another from behind their defenses. In the air, there is greater activity, and it is on the sea that we can discern most clearly the trend of hostilities in the first 4 months of the war. The oceans of the world have been swept clear of German shipping. In our determination to achieve our purpose, we are united among ourselves. We are supported by the peoples of the empire, by the power and the resolution of our great and gallant ally, France, by the moral approval of all who realize that the fate of civilization is bound up with our success. Against such a combination as that, the powers of wickedness will fight in vain. And we, at the beginning of this new year, can await the future with unshaken confidence in the strength of our arms and in the righteousness of our cause.
The War Cabinet looked at the map of Europe to see how the war might be carried to the enemy. For fear of reprisals, Bomber Command was allowed to drop nothing more lethal than pamphlets on the Ruhr. There was one offensive weapon left: to deny Germany essential raw material. Little could be done about Romanian oil, but the Germans imported high-quality iron ore from the Gällivare region of northern Sweden, essential to her war machine. During the summer, this ore was carried down the Baltic, but during the long northern winter it had to pass through the ice-free port of Narvik. A railway line connected the two ports with the iron ore district. Winston Churchill at the Admiralty was determined to fight somewhere on land and proposed the occupation of the whole region. French attention was also focused on this terrain, and they agreed to the plan. But war came to Northern Europe not by British but by Russian action when they attacked Finland. British sympathy went out to the Finns, defending at great odds their lives and homes from the Russian attack. There was a public demand that help should be sent to the Finns against the Nazis' partner in aggression. This public sympathy was utilized to aid the iron ore plan. A supply route of men and arms could be opened up to Finland across Narvik, and the iron ore district would be captured at the same time. But no pressure could overcome the Norwegian and Swedish refusal to allow the passage of Allied troops, and without their permission the War Cabinet would not sanction the operation. By March 12th it was too late for the Finns, and they accepted the Russian demands. This was a heavy blow to the self-esteem of the democracies, who with little reflection were by now prepared to fight all the dictators at once. But it saved Britain from the supreme folly of adding Russia to her enemies. Even without the Finnish pretext, plans continued to be prepared for Allied action in Norway. On 7th of April, monitoring stations the world over were startled to pick up a dramatic break in German broadcasting.
Hier ist der Großdeutsche Rundfunk mit allen deutschen Sendern. Wir bringen eine wichtige Sondermeldung des drahtlosen Dienstes. Das Oberkommando der Wehrmacht gibt bekannt.
5:15 Uhr haben deutsche motorisierte Truppen und Panzerkräfte die deutsch-dänische Grenze bei Flensburg und Sondern überschritten und sind im Vormarsch auf Appenrade und Esbjerg nach Norden.
The Germans got there first. Eluding the home fleet in the early hours of April 7th, German troop transports sailed in a daring, lightning stroke to seize all the Norwegian ports. Paratroops rained from the sky and seized airports. The Norwegians resisted and the Allies promised help, but the war in the north had materialized. British troops were landed during the third week of April in central Norway and were evacuated a few days later. The Allies now ambitiously planned the recapture of Narvik and northern Norway, but it soon became obvious that this too was going wrong. Chamberlain was denounced with a bitterness unparalleled in the annals of the House. A man of peace, he had failed to preserve it. As a man of war, he lost the confidence of the nation. There was no room in war for the deep personal tragedy which overcame Chamberlain in these, the closing months of his life. With dignity, he agreed to step down from the premiership and himself announced over the radio the formation of a coalition government under Churchill. The Twilight War was over. The most dramatic change of premiership of recent times was, however, to occupy a small column in the newspapers. On the morrow of Churchill's appointment, Hitler launched his attack on Belgium, Holland, and Luxembourg. The outcome of the battle was awaited with confidence in Britain. The Allies had been given 8 months to prepare and perfect their plans. But the Allied plans were based on false assumptions. General Gamelin believed that the answer to the German blitzkrieg was still a continuous fortified defensive front. This meant that nearly all the Allied divisions were committed to the front line. The war was expected to be fought in Belgium, because the Maginot Line was thought to be impregnable, and because the Ardennes in the center were thought to be impassable for rapid tank movements. The first war plan, nevertheless, put the most mechanized units of the French army in reserve along the coast behind the BEF. As the conviction grew that the war would be fought in Belgium, expecting a sudden German attack there, a second plan was worked out. The BEF would move at once into Belgium, and the 7th French Army, the original mobile reserve, would move along the coast and link up with the Dutch. Not to provoke Hitler, no detailed staff talks could be held with the Belgians. Nevertheless, 2/3 of all the Allied armor and the best Allied troops were committed to march into Belgium the moment the Germans attacked. This left the Allies without adequate reserves to counter any German breakthrough. The bulk of the remaining front-line French forces were placed behind the Maginot Line, leaving the center to be defended by the Ardennes and only 10 second-line divisions. 2 strong wings and a weak center meant that unless the Germans were prepared to do no more than repeat the Schlieffen plan, this was the recipe for disaster. The German General Staff also had at first looked at the problem in a traditional way. They too were hidebound by the Schlieffen plan, which they believed had failed only because of faulty execution in 1914. Their original pre-war plan, codename Yellow, envisaged a thrust through Belgium just as anticipated by Gamelin. Had they been in a position to attack in the autumn as Hitler had wanted it, the Allied dispositions might have been correct. The bulk of German forces were placed under Army Group B against Belgium under the command of General Bock. The commander of Army Group A in the center, General Rundstedt, and his chief of staff, Manstein, argued for a bolder plan. A center thrust cutting the Allied front in two. Since the chief of staff, General Brauchitsch, was opposed to this, a compromise, the second war plan Yellow, was worked out. It was an unsatisfactory compromise, depriving the Germans of decisive weight on either front. The postponement of operations until late in the spring allowed enough time for General Manstein to win over Hitler, and on the 21st of February 1940, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht adopted the new war plan Yellow, transferring to Rundstedt in the center the bulk of the armored and mechanized formations. This bold offensive plan perfectly exploited the weaknesses of the strategic thinking of the Allies. It was a plan free from the memories of the First World War and was designed to fight by utilizing the new military technology. On the 1st of May, Hitler ordered the army to be ready at 24 hours' notice. The Blitzkrieg had been perfected. Armored formations would race ahead 50 miles a day. Dive bombers would substitute for artillery. Motorized infantry would render the formation of new lines of defense impossible. The ceaseless bombing of railway junctions, of villages along the main roads, and of large cities was all part of the strategy of the Blitzkrieg. The air attacks were designed to create panic and to drive the terror-stricken civilian population on the roads, thereby interfering with the supply routes of the defending armies. It was a demonstration of a ruthless but effective new use of air power. Already perfected in Poland, these Blitzkrieg tactics succeeded even better here, in the most densely populated area of Europe. These victims of the Blitzkrieg not only created transport problems for the Allies, when mobility was already crucial, but their effect on the morale of French and Belgian soldiers was telling. These were their own people, and the army was unable to protect them even behind the front. As the refugees began to block the road running south from Belgium and Holland, General Gamelin and General Georges put War Plan D into effect. With high courage and excellent morale, the 9 divisions of the BEF moved forward to take up their predetermined positions along the River Dyle. General Bock's forces were now pressing on the Allied positions along the northeast fronts. Ably commanded by Lord Gort, the disciplined and well-organized BEF began to retreat in good order. Rundstedt's breakthrough across the Meuse at Sedan, in the meantime, was cutting the Allied front in two. With whatever armor could hastily be collected, the French and British armies belatedly attacked the flanks of Rundstedt's forces. Despite their courage, Allied armor was no match at this stage for the German combination of tanks, anti-tank guns, and dive bombers. Losses were heavy, and they failed to prevent Germans from closing in on the Channel ports. Churchill's first broadcast to the nation had to prepare the country for defeat.
I speak to you for the first time as Prime Minister in a solemn hour for the life of our country, of our empire, of our allies, and above all, of the cause of freedom. A tremendous battle is raging in France and Flanders. The Germans, by a remarkable combination of air bombing and heavily armored tanks, have broken through the French defenses north of the Maginot Line, and strong columns of their armored vehicles are ravaging the open country, which for the first day or two was without defenders. They have penetrated deeply and spread alarm and confusion in their track. Behind them there are now appearing infantry in lorries, and behind them again the large masses are moving forward. After this battle in France abates its force, there will come the battle for our islands, for all that Britain is and all that Britain means. That will be the struggle.
Das Oberkommando der deutschen Wehrmacht ist bekannt. Seit gestern ist auch das englische Expeditionsheer in völliger Auflösung. Sein gesamtes unübersehbares Kriegsmaterial zurücklassend, flüchtet es zum Meere. Schwimmend und auf kleinen Booten versucht der Feind, die auf Rede liegenden englischen Schiffe zu erreichen, auf die sich unsere Luftwaffe, wie schon durch Sondermeldung bekannt gegeben, mit verheerender Wirkung stürzen wird.
For the BEF and the northern armies of France, the beachhead of Dunkirk was the end of the road. What happened to them now depended on others. The beachhead could not have been held against a determined German attack. The weather held and the Germans halted. For 5 days and 6 nights, instead of the expected 40,000, no less than 360,000 were taken on board the ships. The trained manpower of the army was saved with its fighting spirit unbroken. The Navy held command of the sea and the Air Force was undefeated. And British industrial capacity for war was still intact. This fact, no less than the circumstance that the nation's seafaring and fighting tradition had withstood such a test, turned an unprecedented military defeat into a moral victory. What had happened in France was only a battle lost. The miracle of Dunkirk was real enough. After the humiliating and perplexing Munich years, the issues were now simplified and the nation united. In Dunkirk, the Germans saw the destruction of all that which in their view made a modern army. Impressed by the last-ditch defenders, they nevertheless concluded the military strength of Britain was destroyed. In their experience, no army could recover which had been so completely deprived of all its equipment and organization. All that now remained of the war was mopping up in France. There were no plans to continue the war against England. Indeed, there were no plans left to execute. Total victory appeared to be only a matter of time. In the eyes of the German people, the Nazis had fulfilled what they had pledged. They had avenged Versailles. What Dunkirk meant for France was to be faced with the reality of defeat alone. The English Channel, once the lifeline of the alliance, had now turned into a barrier that divided the continent of Europe from the British Isles. With Dunkirk, there also ended an era of British illusions. Gone were the illusions of Munich, of reaching a lasting settlement with Hitler's Germany. Gone, too, the heady reaction to Munich, the illusion that the democracies could afford to base policy on simple ethical premises and oppose all the dictators at once. Unrealistic military commitments had been matched by a diplomacy equally lacking all realism. 3 dictators dominated the continent of Europe. For Britain, the war had become a question of mere survival. But the evacuation from Dunkirk marked also a new beginning, a determination to resist by any means until, in some way as yet unforeseen, the Nazi Reich and its attendant evils would be destroyed.